Good morning, everyone. We'll just wait a few moments to allow everybody to come in. All right, let's begin. Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome from the Edinburgh World Heritage team and our partners. My name is Gabby, and I've had the pleasure of working on the Atlas project for Edinburgh World Heritage as International Training Officer. Some of you are rejoining us from yesterday's sessions, and for those who are just joining us for the first time, we're delighted to have you along for the ride, where we at Edinburgh World Heritage, alongside others, are collaborating and sharing across international boundaries to find common solutions to the challenges of protecting our valued World Heritage sites. Before we begin, let's take care of some housekeeping points. The format for this event is very simple, and we'd like you to get involved by adding your comments in the chat and asking questions using the Q&A tool, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. Please note that there will be 4 presentations, and the Q&A for all of those will be combined into a single session at the end of the last presentation. As usual, your cameras and microphones are muted, but this event is being recorded, so if you do want to catch our discussion at a later time, you will be able to do so. So today is all about finding solutions to the issue of climate change. Once we understand what the threat is to World Heritage, we then need to look at ways of addressing the threat, how we can adapt our traditional buildings, how we can mitigate the climate emergency by reducing our carbon emissions, and how we can engage the community to encourage people to take action. Today's talks will show how sustainable heritage management can be actively addressed through individual buildings, community engagement, and a sensitive collective approach to the historic public realm. So firstly, we'll hear from Leila Angelica from Historic Environment Scotland, who'll give us a whistle-stop tour of methods of adapting traditional buildings. Then we'll hear from Jan Grandgirard, who you may remember from yesterday, who would explore the Canongate Housing project as a case study of building mitigation and community engagement. Building on this, pun intended, Nick Hotham will talk about capacity building and how Edinburgh World Heritage undertakes community engagement. And finally, we'll turn our attention a few miles down the M8 motorway to Glasgow, where Ian Hingley will describe the recently completed public realm work to Sauchiehall Street in the centre of Glasgow, exploring how we can design for a sustainable future in an historic environment. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Leila.
Hello everyone, thank you very much. So my name is Leila Angelica, I work for Historic Environment Scotland, and I'm in the Technical Research Unit within Conservation. Part of our role is basically to do projects, energy efficiency projects lately, that's sort of the focus, and write them in publications, and we also write a lot of technical advice. So I have packed in quite a lot in today's presentation, so my apologies in advance, but I hope you find it useful. So basically, what does climate change mean in Scotland? It generally means milder and wetter winters, increased rainfall, which causes landslide. We have greater frequency of severe weather events, high winds and storms, rising sea levels, and consequently rising water table. And here you can see some, apologies. So here you can see some of these effects, I guess. And one of the main reasons is that extreme events basically are becoming more common. In January 2012, there was the highest recorded winds ever in many parts of Scotland. So there is an increasing risk of flooding, cause of flooding from storm surges. In some areas there is landslide. So buildings are under threat from coastal erosion and sea level rise, but we're not going to cover this today. However, there is more surface runoff, which is resulting in high moisture levels in external walls or adjacent areas. And that moisture from soils can contaminate porous stone with damaging cells, which can cause decay or accelerate stone decay. So yeah, if we look at the impact on traditional buildings, so most of these buildings were actually designed to deal with this weather, and in Scotland, it's quite a harsh climate. So although some of these buildings have functioned perfectly for a long time, with the changing climate, they may not be able to function in the same way. So these buildings, they may need to be adapted to ensure their sort of long-term survival. And these, what you can see is some of the effects that climate change is causing to these buildings. And it's saturation of masonry and the leaching of lime, which causes instability. And internally, you have higher internal humidity. You have increased growth of algae and vegetation. And again, all of these things with the ground shrinkage in summer can cause instability of the soil and the building. And here's a slide we always show in our presentations, just to show that basically what maintenance is like, and that maintenance has to come first before thinking about adaptation or doing anything further to the building. So the materials we're using in traditional construction, so stone, lime, timber, are quite enduring and are effective in traditional construction, but provided that the building is maintained. And often there is a poor maintenance or a backlog of repairs with incorrect materials, poor appreciation of detailing. There's also the difficulty in working heights. So all of these things basically leave the building quite vulnerable to severe weather. So if we zoom in the wall, sort of in the micro scale, what does that mean for a building? So we're talking about extreme weather events. We're talking about increased precipitation. When older buildings are subjected to high moisture loads through persistent and constant, like heavy or driving rain, the masonry can get saturated. So damp walls can lead to the leaching of lime, of the binder from wall, which causes the instability of the wall, and then the stones can be sort of dislodged. And you can see how this, in that nice drawing, how the wall basically bulges out. In addition to this, when you have incompatible materials such as cement renders or quite hard renders and impervious paints used externally or internally, this can disrupt the necessary movement that you need to have of moisture going through the wall to dry out. So internally, you have higher relative humidity levels, which can lead to timber decay of basically the joists, but also of the linings. And with additional measures such as insulation and vapor barriers or blocking natural ventilation, you hinder basically the drying process. And poor ventilation increases the risk of condensation. So there is risk of mold growth and further timber decay. So what to do when we're thinking about upgrades, what to do? The first thing is to reinstate traditional finishes and also the weather detailing. So generally the focus in today's society and our response to climate change is carbon reduction in housing. So especially older buildings, the ones built before 1919, are considered hard to treat. But in fact, many of these buildings, they have substantial solid masonry walls, so they actually perform better in terms of energy performance than what we think. So with moderate adaptation, they can actually considerably improve, can be improved to have increased energy efficiency to acceptable levels. So whilst these buildings are as I said, they're quite well built, they may need to be adapted to cope with the changing climate. and you may need to adapt their traditional details, or you may need to introduce new ones. But if you do go down the road, these details and materials need to be compatible with the building and to match its character. And obviously it's a case-by-case approach. And if your building is listed or in a conservation area or in the World Heritage Site, you need to think about what that means and the implications in designations. So I will basically go from top to bottom to building. I have packed in quite a lot, so apologies. But even if you keep something from all that, that's still quite good. So chimneys, to start from the top, they're the most exposed element in the building and are quite hard to access. But you do need to check their cants and haunching, the copes and overhang drip. The masonry will be degraded because it's the most exposed element. So you will need to check the mortar joints, and either the stone or brick, it may need rebuilding. And if you do need to rebuild, you need to think of correct materials and the correct detailing, having a drip mold if there isn't one. If you do need to adapt it, you can use lead to cloak it. And always vent with coals, even if the fireplace or the flue is close below, especially if we're talking about tenements where there's a lot of things happening there. Moving on to skew copes and tabling. So this is often a neglected area, and it's unfortunately also a point of weakness for water penetration. So dampness in gable walls is most commonly due to a combination of factors, defects in the chimneys, skews, the pointing, and also frequently blocked drones and downpipes. Also cement pointing or renders can exacerbate the problem, as cement is actually vulnerable to cracking. So it basically allows water to come into the building, into the wall, and stay in, it becomes trapped. So you need to look at string courses. You see in that on that image, there's something that looks like a bulge out. It's not a string course, but it's something like that. So you need to check all those details, what there is, if you do need to do anything else. So if there is an overhang, so the overhang would be the gables or skews projecting slightly. If there isn't one and that gable is exposed, you will need to think about redesigning it, or you can put lead underneath following that line of the skew and sort of a string course. Some buildings have skew puts, which is, as you see in that image, there is actually a little skew put that is to drive the water away, and also cuts and channels. So I have some images here which can help you actually see those things in detail. So this image is a raised molding on an upper skew cope, which is meant to ensure effective runoff. So as I said before about overhang, the width of the skew cope is important, and that gives this overhang to allow the water to run off and stay away from the top of the gable. So additional detailing like this may be required, and you can either do it with sort of stone or mortar, or you can use lead. And here is the detail I mentioned about the cut, the channel cut. You can see on the image to the left, that's the diagonally cut line, and it's meant to direct the water to the slates or to the middle, sort of to the middle of the next slate or the tiles, and to the gutter and away from the building. The image to the right, there's no skew put, there's nothing, and it's more vulnerable to the weather effect, really. Here is another approach that is quite visually striking. Before I speak about this one, so another approach which is not shown here is, in some cases, defective skew copes can be rebedded onto a lead damp-proof course to provide extra protection against water ingress. So if this approach is taken, the copes will need to be secured in place by additional fixings to avoid slippage. What you see here is a step further. So you basically cover the whole skew with lead. It's quite a drastic measure, and it's when other repairs are not possible. And again, fastenings are quite important for wind lift in such case. This is a halfway approach. It's kind of between cloaking the whole skew with lead. It's called a secret gutter and half clocking. So funny story here is lately I've seen quite a few emails and cases in Edinburgh in the new town where this approach is taken or proposed, I guess, by roofing contractors to do this. But then when the lead turns and goes onto the slates or tiles, basically it just sits on top of them. It's not secure. So that is not appropriate for use in buildings. It's a very short-term measure because it's going to be easily lifted by the wind. So as we're talking about roofs and I can talk about a little bit about slating. So you need to think about whether your slates are appropriate, are working okay, and if the laps are actually correct, and if there are any suggestions that these are not correct. If there is an underlay already, think about and there are mold issues or sort of damp issues, you need to think about introducing airflow to your roof. Also, in exposed areas or areas of high wind, you need to check about fastening, so securing the slates with an additional cheek nailing every 4th or 6th course. And also, you need to think about the minimum slate size if you're redressing the slates. What you see here on the image is a roof where there's no overhang. So the slate is actually chamfered to drive the water towards the middle of the slate below. In some locations, lime mortar used to close gaps in a pan-tile roof, which is called torching, but I'm not gonna get into that here. It is mostly done in England, and it's for areas where there's a lot of wind-driven rain. So this is a zoomed in image of a roof and shows you how a roof with a water gate, secret gutter, is done. So this is an additional feature for larger volumes of water. So basically you have a lead channel or a lead gutter that is formed at the eaves and then raggled into the skews. I don't know how much you can see here, but basically the lead is going under the skews. And then slates are dressed over. This is quite durable. It's expensive, but it's a durable approach. A lot of buildings also have mortar fillets or lead skews, and typically the junction is finished with a weak cement mortar and a lead soaker underneath. This is also an acceptable approach. But anything you do like that, make sure it's fixed properly. And we shouldn't forget about rainwater goods. These should be checked regularly. Should be checked twice a year, but the reality is that, especially in tenements, that's not very easy to do because of the height. So you should check gutters and downpipes. There's vulnerability to blockages, especially because throughout the years they tend to become smaller. So you may need to replace them with appropriate ones, or you may need to actually think about having wider gutters if they're not coping with the changing climate. Again, there's often poor replacement and additions with poor detailing and connections. And also think about that warmer temperatures and wetter winters, the combination of that may result in increased vegetation growth with potential to block the rainwater goods. And this is an image that I put, which actually shows you one of these bad connections and bad detailing, and you see all the algae that he has caused to the stonework. Moving on to the walls. Walls, chimneys and skew copes are the things that are most exposed. Walls also matter. Even well-maintained masonry walls with good detailing, they may need additional protection from driving rain. And traditionally, people knew this, and this was understood. So rubble masonry was commonly protected by a layer of lime harling and a finished coat of lime wash. So rubble work by its nature consists of a high proportion of exposed joints. It's a larger surface. So it was often used on side or rear elevations or in buildings of lower status. And then these buildings, they were protected by a lime hull or lime wash. Again, with hard cement-based renders, which are quite, they used to be a bit more frequent than we would have liked, they don't help with water retention, whereas traditional lime, by contrast, is well suited to provide the additional protection you need from the wind-driven rain, but it's also quite flexible, so it works with the building, it works better and reduce the instance of hairline cracking. It works with the building when the building, and if the building is moving for any reason, whilst the open pore structure of lime hurling allows the water vapor dispersal and prevents the moisture buildup in a masonry wall. And here you see the traces of original render on the gable end of an 18th century building in Stirling. To say, we have written a lot of publications on these subjects, and because there's a lot of information, please look at our website, which I'll have a link at the end, and we have technical papers on these subjects 27 to 33. It's all about lime. So moving on to the walls, basically, historic evidence shows that most buildings were covered actually with a lime hull and a lime wash. And so reinstatement of external coatings has proven to be an effective approach in managing the effects of wind-driven rain, even in exposed locations. We have actually done a refurbishment case study of a building in Shetland, which was quite exposed. Traditionally, it wouldn't have had any hurling, but there were ongoing issues. So we introduced the hurling, and so far it's performing well. So that's another thing to think about. And when you are doing this, you also need to think about, it's an opportunity to think about external wall insulation that you wouldn't have had in other cases. And again, we shouldn't forget about other kinds of detailing. Often parapets and cornices, they're considered architectural details, but they're not just that. They're like highly functioning elements of a building, so their role is not fully appreciated. So the highest part of the building, parapets are one of the most exposed elements, and when you're in areas of high exposure, you may need to think about remodeling these parapets. And you can see here actually how the rain is driven onto parapets and sills and cornices. So these are the areas you need to think about protecting. And in the drawing to the right, you see, for example, when you cloak a parapet, it has to sort of dip outwards, so it drives the rain away. So you need to think about detailing, really. And here is an image of a building where the detailing was not sufficient. So in some cases, especially when you have a sill which is flush, you need to think about, again, adaptation. So this is basically adding a new drip detail here on the underside of the sill to help drive the water away from the wall. And that's another example of a building where there were actually string courses, but they were not working sufficiently for the building. So new string courses were designed, but as you can see, they have been designed to match the building. Below ground drainage, that's another long topic, but I'm just gonna roll through it again. So rainfall levels increase, so that means the solid ground floors may be vulnerable to wetting, and raised water tables, water runoff from adjacent areas, and splashback of water onto the building. All these can cause problems. But the drainage itself also should be adequately managed to ensure that water is running effectively and it's being dispersed away from the structure. For example, through the formation of gullies or drainage pipes below ground. So there are a few things you need to check, whether your drainage has been cleaned, where the pipe goes, if there are any sort of softenings of footings and foundations, especially around the corners, which actually happened to my building a week ago. A note here is when you have a downpipe, it should actually terminate into a gully trap with an open angle shoe, as you see on the image to the right. this will prevent a blockage below ground, causing water to back up. And methods such as tanking, they are not really advisable, because they usually lead in trapping the moisture in the structure, and then it moves up to the walls. Now, internally, what does it all mean? Basically, with the changing climatic conditions and the high precipitation and saturation of walls, this results to higher level of moistures in the air and inside the building. So there's a greater risk of condensation, which can give rise to mold, timber decay, and insect attack to structural timbers, but also to your furniture, your walls, depending on how bad it is. So, and measures designed to address energy efficiency, like insulation, and sometimes they actually cause too much airtightness. And increased airtightness is linked to elevated levels of CO2 and other pollutants. So this has detrimental effect on the occupant's health, but also the health of the building. So you need to think about the conditions you have in your building, and one of the best things to do is to have adequate ventilation, to air your space, but also background warmth. The combination of that is helping a lot with a lot of those issues, but also buffering of internal conditions with the right finishes. So in areas, for example, when you have minor moisture ingress, if you use the correct use of internal lime plaster applied directly onto the existing masonry and finished with a breathable coating such as lime wash or clay paint, that actually helps a lot. Modern stain blocking or mold resistant paints, they don't really work. They can inhibit the passage of moisture and should not be used in areas of high moisture load. So a bit between sort of drainage and ground levels and all that is, when you're thinking about ventilation, you need to make sure what's happening also on sort of lower level. So any ground levels should be checked, and if they are raised over time, so they need to be lowered if that is the case, and you need to make sure that all your vents are free and unobstructed, and just make sure that the air is flowing into your building as it should be. And also often the things such as pavements and hard landscaping that are butting against a traditional building that have not been detailed properly, and that causes issues to the building. All of those things are basically, we've written them in our adaptation guide, which is the short guide 11 that you see, the red one. And to summarize, it's basically the three things to think about is keep your building well maintained and in a good state of repair. You may need to reinstate traditional detailing or to actually enhance your building with new detailing, which is matching the character of the building. And also you may need to improve surface drainage around your building. Also mentioned a study, which is the House Sand. It's the one to the right in Shetland, where we actually put lime mortar hull where there wasn't one. So we've written it up if you want to read this. And now I'm gonna very, very quickly speak about a case study that we did, which is the Holyrood Park Lodge, a building between the Holyrood House and the Parliament building. And we haven't done anything externally, but this is more about internal repairs. So there was a lot of repairs from the 80s and 90s. We stripped some of them out, tried to reuse anything we could. We insulated the floors with wood fiber board insulation, which is a breathable material. We used new double glaze units fitted into the existing timber windows because they were of good quality. But we also used draft roofing. We used wood fiber boards to insulate the roof, but we created a warm roof and a cold roof. It can be a whole new presentation talking about this. not forgetting the coombs, which are very common in Scotland. So they're quite a hard area to insulate. So we have written up how we did that. We insulated the doors with aerogel, which is quite thin and suitable for places like this, such as doors. And we insulated the walls with blown cellulose fiber. This goes between the masonry, the stone masonry, and the lath plaster. And you can see in the panels we created throughout the lodge, you can actually view these interventions or these measures by having these viewing panels. All these materials are breathable and work well with a building of that age and of that construction, but we shouldn't forget about ventilation. And here we try to reinstate any ventilation that was blocked and any airflow that was obstructed by clearing vents and reopening windows. And this building is a bit of a success story for us because it went from band F to recently band C. And it shows you that a traditional building can actually be retrofitted to meet the new energy standards, and that doesn't have to have a detrimental effect on the building. At the moment, we're also in the process of putting some renewables, probably an air source heat pump somewhere, and insulate some difficult areas such as the top of bay windows with hemp insulation to trial it. Forgot to say that we've done a lot of monitoring on this, so we actually have evidence to present how these materials and measures have worked on the building. And that is the case study that you can read some of it, but we're also writing a technical paper which is specifically on the monitoring. So apologies, that was a lot of content, but thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Lida. That was a lot of food for thought. I will pass on now to Jan, please.
Thanks, Gabby. I'm going to share my presentation. Oh, I think we just need to stop sharing. Thanks, lovely. So now I'm going to share the presentation with you. Okay, that's all good. So my name is Jan Grangira. I'm Climate Change Manager with Edinburgh World Heritage, and today I'm going to present the Canongate Housing Energy Efficiency and Conservation Project. But before we start the presentation, I would like to introduce you to Edinburgh World Heritage Trust. We are an independent charity in charge of the management of the World Heritage Site in partnership with Historic Environment Scotland and the City of Edinburgh Council. Our vision is that the World Heritage status is a dynamic force that benefits everyone. Our mission is to connect people to their heritage, and our objectives are to protect the World Heritage Site, to promote its values, and to build capacity within its boundaries and beyond. Recently, we've adopted our climate emergency strategy, and the Canongate Housing Energy Efficiency and Conservation Project is an element part of it. Here is an outline of the presentation, and I'll start with an overview of the project. We'll then briefly look at the Canongate housing development, and then we'll review in detail the proposed integrated and replicable delivery model for energy efficiency and conservation works in historic buildings. And we'll finish off with learnings and next steps. So the Canongate Housing Energy Efficiency and Conservation Project is a pilot funded by the Scottish Government via its Energy Efficient Scotland programme. It was led by Edinburgh World Heritage and delivered in partnership with the City of Edinburgh Council. And the objective was to help owners to upgrade their buildings. So our role was to act as a facilitator and help owners to act as the client of their own project. Our initial time frame was November 2017 until March 2019, but we had some delays, and we managed to achieve most of the activities in March this year. We still have some monitoring that is ongoing. I'm going to talk about this in the presentation. In terms of general objectives, I mentioned the first one, which is to carry out energy efficiency and conservation work in a hard-to-treat building. and then come to the definition of art to treat in a couple of slides. And our second objective was to test and inform an integrated and replicable delivery model, including energy efficiency and conservation work, community engagement, social and technical monitoring, energy efficiency advice and on-site support, and financing model. And the idea was to make sure that this model could be applicable to any historic buildings. The diagram here presents the various stakeholders that were involved in the project, and as you can see, they were quite numerous. On the right-hand side in brown, there were the funders and the facilitator, and Edinburgh World Heritage was coordinating all of them in direct link with the client. In green, that was the Canongate Development Owners Committee. And on the left-hand side in blue, you can find the professionals, advisor, and contractors. So the professionals that were directly appointed by the client. We can quote the design team led by John Gibbert, architect, based in Glasgow. There are conservation and sustainability accredited, and the contractor Red Path Constructions, also based in Glasgow. Now let's have a look at the Canongate Housing development. This is a post-war complex of 3 blocks designed by a famous Scottish architect, Basil Spence, and that was achieved in the late 60s. These buildings are B-listed, and they are located on the rail mile in the World Heritage site, so in a prominent part of the city. They are also owned by multiple owners, and for these reasons, they are considered as art to treat. And we've decided to work on block 2. You can see at the bottom on the right-hand side, a block composed of 12 flats and 2 commercial units at the bottom, with a total of 11 owners. There were a couple of issues in terms of repair and maintenance across the development, and you can see a couple of examples on the photos with concrete spalling, moss issues and staining, and also structural cracks on the right-hand side. There were also a couple of issues in terms of energy performance and internal comfort, with insignificant, almost no insulation in the building. There were single glazed windows. There were lots of thermal bridging due to the original design, inefficient or no heating system in one case, and mold ventilations and condensation issues. So now let's have a look at the delivery model, and let's start with the community engagement aspect of it. We had to face a couple of challenges to implement the project at the very start. There was no legal entity for the owners to manage the building and carry out repairs. There was also some legal complexity in relation to the title deed. So these are the ownership title for the properties. And as a result, implementing communal decisions was quite complicated from a legal perspective. When we started the project, we didn't know exactly the cost for the works and how they would be covered, which obviously was quite of a challenge when securing and maintaining flat and business owners' involvement in the project, especially at the very start. To address these problems, we've implemented a couple of strategies and solutions. And first, we use ADORESSING conservation funding program methodology, which is aiming at helping owners to get organized and form a committee to manage the project and the works. We've been giving them advice and support throughout the whole process on various aspects, and we provided also funding to cover the conservation work. So the conservation funding program, basically. We also managed to cover the cost of the design phase, including legal advice on the title deeds, in order for the owners to understand the full costs of the project that were involved before they can make a decision and commit financially to the project. We also managed to secure and set up a funding package covering energy efficiency and conservation works. And we organized regular meetings to make sure owners understood the purpose of the project and the progress and different steps of it. Now let's have a look at a couple of figures in terms of community engagement. So as I mentioned, we were working on block 2 that encompasses 12 flats and 2 businesses. A total of 32 persons were involved in the project. We organized 23 meetings with the owners, mostly during the design phase. And we managed to engage all the owners of block 2 in the process, but the last one was engaged, joined the project in August 2018, so which means 8 months after the start of the project, and also at a moment where the design phase was ongoing, so which was quite of a challenge. So this is a slide presenting the funding package to cover the capital cost, and we use 4 sources of funding. The first one was EWH Conservation Funding Program that represented 17% of the total capital costs. We also secure owners' contribution, so 14 out of 14 properties, which represents also 70% of the total cost. The Scottish Government Energy Efficient Scotland grant of 37%, and during the design phase, we also managed to secure Scottish Power Energy Networks Green Economy Fund for a total of 27% of the total cost of the project. So the total capital cost, to give you an idea, amounts to £1,200,000 for the whole project. Some learnings about the funding package. First, we should say that cost of the works could be prohibitive for owners, and we need to find solutions to address this issue that is preventing the implementation of these works. So we looked at a scheme named Pay As You Save, which relies on, which the principle basically is to cover the cost of the works using savings from the energy bills, but that was too complex in the context of multi-ownership properties. Therefore, we explored other options, and one we think could work is to use a repayable grant system based on the EWH Conservation Funding Program. So using a revolving fund with repayable grants, and that could cover only energy efficiency works. And that would complement our grant with the Conservation Funding Program and to target conservation works. There is also the possibility of grant funding, one-off grants, but this is less replicable. And in Scotland, we have 3 interest loans schemes run by the Scottish Government. There are Home Energy Scotland for domestic properties, and for businesses, there is the Resource Efficient Scotland SME loan. But the key idea here is to combine different funding to cover different types of works, and both conservation and energy efficiency. But we have to bear in mind that having multiple funders means multiple requirements, and sometimes it's adding complexity in terms of admin for the project. So now I would like to talk about the energy efficiency and conservation works. To carry out these works, we've embraced with the design team a holistic and whole house approach. So with different steps, and the first one was to understand the architectural and historical significance of the building, and to do that we commissioned a conservation statement that you can see on the right hand side by the architectural practice based in Edinburgh, Simpson and Brown. Then was a requirement to understand the building's performance and the current issues of the buildings, and potentially some initial design issues as well and flows. The design team collected experience from the residents, owners, and users to understand more about these issues, and all of this informed the design. that would include repairs and energy efficiency improvements, both internally and externally. And it's really important to consider both at the same time, because you cannot implement energy efficiency improvements if you're not making sure that your building is wind and watertight, and for instance, there is no leaks that could damage the energy efficiency improvements. And again, the global idea here is to strike a right balance between sensitive adaptation and sensitive conservation and energy efficiency. Here is a list of the main measures we've implemented. So they cover conservation measures from concrete to render and roof repairs, fabric upgrades with insulation, including attic and flat roof insulation, as well as cavity wall insulation. We also graded the windows with double and triple glazing. We installed more efficient heating system in some instances, and in all the flats we've installed smart controls for the heating systems. There were some lighting upgrades with LED systems. There was some mechanical ventilation with heat recovery installed in all the flats and in one commercial unit. And the design team carried out a micro-generation feasibility study to understand what type of net zero or low carbon heating system could be implemented in the building. So these are the windows, and it's interesting to see on the left-hand side the original, one of the remaining original window that were in the building, that was in the building, and on the right-hand side the new bespoke windows with double glazing that we installed. Another example with one prominent element of the building, so the balcony windows, again on the left-hand side the original single glazed window, in the middle the new window, and on the right-hand side an original drawing from Basil Spence practice. So the idea is really to mimic exactly the original details by improving the performance of the glazing. These are some energy efficiency measures. On the left-hand side, you can see a VHR system, so the mechanical ventilation with heat recovery. And on the right-hand side, a smart control for the heating systems that you can control with your mobile phone. In addition to reinstating the original design of the windows that was lost at some point, we also reinstating the original painting scheme designed by Basil Spence in the 60s. So on the left-hand side, you can see the building how it was before the works, and on the right-hand side after the works. So painting scheme was really important in the original aesthetic of the building. And this is another example at the rear of the building. Again, left was the condition of the building before the works, and on the right-hand side after the works. So you can see the significant difference and the improvement in terms of aesthetics. An important part of the works consisted in repairing the concrete elements of the buildings that were also very important in terms of architectural significance, and that was quite tricky because you need really to do that very carefully and use specific techniques. On the left, from left to right, you can see the process with the concrete spooling, and then the breakout of the concrete element, the cast, and then the repair concrete balustrade. With specific attention to reinstate the timber shuttering marks are really part of the character of the concrete elements in the building. Now let's talk about the social and technical monitoring. That was a requirement from the Scottish government in this project. And that we carried out before the installation of the measures and after their installation. So the principle was for us to recruit volunteers amongst the owners, and they had the possibility to opt out at any point during the project in terms of monitoring. So we had a sample of 5 flats and 2 commercial units, and social monitoring consisted in questionnaires done face-to-face, and the technical monitoring in the installation of monitoring devices. And so we had 3 types. We had the tiny tags, you can see at the bottom left, that we used to monitor temperature and humidity in the flats. We have 26 of them installed in the flats and the communal areas, and also and loops and holes that you can see on the top left and on the right hand side, that we use to monitor electricity and gas consumption in the flats and commercial units. Now I would like to share with you some figures about the expected improvement in the buildings based on the calculation carried out by the design team. So we expect a decrease of 66% of carbon emissions as a result of the works, a decrease of 73% of energy consumption in the building, and a reduction of 51% of fuel bills, some saving on the energy bills for the residents. Finally, a last element to the delivery model is the energy efficiency advice and on-site support. So throughout the project, we organized events and workshops to build capacity amongst the owners on different subjects, such as maintenance, energy efficiency advice, or on energy behavior. And this month, we'll have a workshop. So the design team is organizing a workshop to provide training on the equipment installed in the building, including the MVHR system and the smart control for the heating systems. We also managed to use the project progress and results as a source to build capacity for the owners during our meetings with them. And we use different partnerships with national stakeholders such as Home Energy Scotland and Resource Efficient Scotland to deliver the workshops. Finally, Block 3 and 1 will benefit from the learnings, and they've already been in touch with us to understand what has been implemented in Block 2 to potentially redo it in their own block. Finally, I would like to share with you some learnings and the next steps about the projects. And first, it's important to mention that community-led projects are complex, but complexity is sometimes relative, which means that the more we do of these projects, the better we get at delivering them. We can establish strong processes, and that's the point of our proposed delivery model. In those projects, it's really important to empower owners to make informed decisions, and communication is key in that regard. In the context of the climate emergency, it's important to unlock historic buildings' potential to reduce carbon emissions, but we need to be proactive in order to avoid maladaptation and unintended consequences of these schemes when they are badly managed and implemented, by demonstrating best practice. And we can do that using pilot projects. So we definitely need more pilot projects to understand what could work in different types of buildings. Again, there is space for partnerships between councils and local heritage stakeholders, or any kind of stakeholders that could work in that area, to implement more pilot projects, but also to form a pipeline of projects for the future. It's also important to mention that these types of projects provide wider benefits, whether it's social, economic, and environmental benefits. And I would like to conclude on the next steps for EWH in this area of work. So we'll be looking for more pilot projects targeting other typologies that we can find in the World Heritage site, and we'll be looking for volunteers amongst property owners. We'll be collaborating with the City of Edinburgh Council on a citywide retrofit program, and we'll continue our work in terms of advocacy and capacity building within the World Heritage site. That's the end of my presentation. I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very, very much, Jan. I'll now pass on to Nick, who's going to discuss advocacy and clear messaging about climate change. Nick?
Thank you, Gabby. Just give me a second to share my screen, and then we will get going. So this is looking at the challenges associated with the climate emergency from a different angle, really looking at the question of public engagement, as well as influencing and shaping policymakers' attitudes towards the climate response and the historic environment, local politicians, local community leaders, etc. So very much from a communications and advocacy perspective, rather than from a technical one. And so that's my specific area of expertise and work at EWH. So the starting point for any advocacy program is to think about what the barriers are in the minds of individuals, policymakers, politicians, leaders. And we had concluded that there was a strong sense that the heritage sector was seen as a barrier to decisive action in response to the climate emergency, rather than a solution. And that we were relatively conservative and resistant to change, and that we were looking at the historic environment as something which needs to be protected at all costs, even if that means not effectively addressing the challenge of the climate response, the climate emergency. Also, that we're relatively slow in adopting innovation into the built environment, and that we are somehow also elitists, that we're not really part of local communities and don't speak for local communities. So these are to some extent exaggerated, but these are conversations that we've heard over the years. And it's useful, I think, to make those clear, because you can then structure the advocacy program and the communications program to address these specific barriers. And I'm sure we would have all heard similar comments across European cities, similar thoughts and mindsets. So in terms of the objectives for this program, it's quite simply to design and implement an advocacy campaign that addresses these mindsets, stimulates debate within communities on climate-related issues. So we really want to get people talking about this and elevate the climate response within the city to be a topic that's talked about at the same level as the alleviation of poverty, the impact of tourism, to elevate the importance of the topic in the city. To put heritage at the heart of the debate, given that we live in a city of so many listed buildings and historic monuments and an important historic public realm, to put heritage at the heart of the debate, and also to address the mixed messages which sometimes come out of the heritage sector. Some people will be being more positive about the opportunity within the sector, others will be more conservative. So the idea is how can we move together as a sector and have one common set of messages. So the strategy was then to be just really proactive and set out what we believe, so that we can really directly address ingrained mindsets. And another important part of the strategy was to ensure that there was action to underpin and support the advocacy and the messaging. So it's not just about spin or clever communication strategies. It's also about the work on the ground, which you've been hearing about from Jan and from others, to complement. But I think it's really important that the technical work is complemented by strong advocacy and communications work. Otherwise, the benefits of the technical work are really less than they could be. So the idea was simply to develop and launch and promote a climate emergency manifesto. And I've just put there, I'm sure everyone's familiar with the idea of a political manifesto in countries across Europe. And it's something that we have used at EWH for our own advocacy and communications programs. It's a simple, neat, and focused way of really telling the world what we believe in, and defending it and stimulating public discourse on an important topic. I'm sure you're very familiar in terms of the political environment. It's a device that's used consistently by all of the political parties in the United Kingdom, as well as across Europe, to publish a manifesto, catchy title, It's Time for Real Change, Stronger for Scotland. And within that, to really distill down key actions that will be taken, beliefs and thoughts about the future that would be taken if a political party is elected. So the idea of a political manifesto, I think, is a good one for the heritage sector to use. We published our first Edinburgh World Heritage Manifesto for the 2017 local government elections. We wanted to get moving in this area, and we included in our manifesto things like take steps to ensure economic development within the World Heritage Site benefits residents, not only businesses and visitors, prioritize the reuse of old buildings over demolition and new build, and make better attempts to find sustainable long-term solutions for historic buildings, conduct an objective reassessment with partners of the buildings at risk register, etc. So we had 10 points within our political manifesto for those local elections. And we were then able to influence the manifestos of the political parties within the city. And as a result of that, the Scottish National Party, the Labour Party and the Conservative Party all included within their manifestos for the city a commitment to protect and enhance the World Heritage Site. So we were pleased with that outcome. We also took the opportunity of the local elections in 2017 to run a political hustings, which is a meeting with the citizens of the city and political representatives of all the parties to thrash through and to discuss some of the heritage related issues in the city. And Edinburgh people feel very, very strongly about some of these questions. So that was a fun and engaging way of putting heritage at the heart of the discussion in the local elections. We've also used the idea of a manifesto to give young people a voice, and in 2018 we developed a young person's heritage manifesto with a group of our young ambassadors so that young people could say how they wanted to see the heritage of the city managed in the future. So in terms of how you do this, pulling it together, it's important to start with that there are differences of opinion within the heritage sector, and just within Edinburgh World Heritage, strong differences of opinion between our conservation architects, between our technical experts and other members of the team. And this is an opportunity and a process to create alignment and common ground within the organization, and to make sure that we say in English, singing from the same hymn sheet. We're all singing in harmony. We all have the same hymn sheet in front of us. We're not discordant in any way, and we're all clear so that we can start to change minds, change opinions of key people outside the organization. So we then published our climate emergency manifesto during the Scottish Climate Week last September, published it on our website, and I'll just take you through one or two of the key points. I won't go through the whole thing. I'd encourage you to go to the website to read the whole document. But here are some of the key thoughts from it. And the first and probably the crucial point is to say that the historic environment and our traditional buildings are part of the solution to effectively dealing with the climate emergency. That's the core of our philosophy and belief system. The old and new towns of Edinburgh is of unique value to Scotland, but also to the world, and comprises nearly 4,500 individual buildings, 75% of which are listed for their historical significance. And we say that as we address the challenges of the climate emergency, this extraordinary heritage asset must be taken into account and indeed become part of the solution. We believe that through regular maintenance, high quality conservation, and the implementation of sensitive energy efficiency and adaptation measures, Edinburgh's historic environment can be at the heart of the city's plans to address the challenges of climate change. So that's really the core of the manifesto. And if there's one thing that I want everyone really to learn by heart and to be able to use in what's called the elevator pitch, the 1 minute speech you might get to make to an important person within the city, that's it. And everything else that follows comes from that. That's the first point. The second point, I think, is also just attempting to achieve a change of mindset, that many of the measures that will be taken to address the climate emergency are also an opportunity to strengthen the conservation, understanding and appreciation of the old and new towns of Edinburgh World Heritage Site. So if these things are done carefully, the measures we take to address the climate emergency can also enhance the conservation and appreciation of the World Heritage Site. There doesn't need to be a conflict. And there are many areas where this is true. We heard about the energy reduction impact of the measures we can take in buildings. That makes it cheaper for people to live in historic buildings, which means that we have a more diverse and inclusive range of individuals living within our World Heritage Site. The reduction of car traffic and interventions around active travel, all of that will lead to an enhancement of people's appreciation and understanding of the World Heritage Site, et cetera, et cetera. So this is all about positioning the two things together. I'll speed up a bit. Thirdly, the historic environment and our traditional buildings are inherently sustainable. So these are our ancient buildings in Scotland are made from local materials, huge amount of embodied carbon within the structure, adapted to local weather conditions. And while those weather conditions are changing, the fundamental structure and design of the buildings is sound and sustainable. So that's a very important one. And conversely, replacing a traditional building with a new one which may be considered to be superficially more efficient is obviously wasteful and unsustainable and not something that we would support. And the last one I'll share with you, regular maintenance. We're very keen on maintenance in Edinburgh and at Edinburgh World Heritage. Regular maintenance of traditional buildings can both mitigate the effects of climate change and improve energy efficiency. So that's a way of reframing the importance of maintenance. It's not simply one of those mundane tasks that need to be done on an annual basis or a quarterly basis. Regularly maintaining your building can be an important contribution to addressing the climate emergency. So those are some of the points. You can see these are sort of really key top-line messages that we can all use in EWH in our interactions with communities, with politicians, with national figures, and internationally. So it was a valuable exercise to go through that and to realize actually that we agree on 99% of these points. When it comes to the technical detail of the interventions required into a historic structure, obviously there's going to be debate and discussion about how far we can go, but most of the time we are aligned. So having published the Climate Emergency Manifesto, we want to take full benefit from that and make sure that that's in the public eye. So we then organized a public meeting. Because of the pandemic, it was online. And this was part of a program of events which we call In Conversation with Edinburgh World Heritage. This one was focused on the climate emergency. Can heritage be part of the solution? With a number of friends and experts taking part in the discussion. And we had an attendance, about 450 people joined that discussion. So we were pleased with that, and the online format does work quite well for us. We do quite a quick, snappy 1 hour conversation between 6 and 7 as people are enjoying their aperitif before supper in Edinburgh. They settle down, tune into one of these talks, and that seems to work very well for us. Able to then amplify that in social media through the social media channels which we use, including Instagram, focused on a more younger demographic, Facebook and Twitter, quite significant reach figures for those channels. So together with the website, we calculated that we reached around 100,000 people with this content in a city of 500,000. So we were quite pleased with those results. There was some press coverage as well. This press coverage is an example of how things can go a little bit wrong, and also illustrates the fact that some of our politicians and supporters may not quite get the complexity of the issue. Solar panels are not going to be a panacea to solving the issues of the climate emergency in Edinburgh, clearly not. But it was one of those comments that was made in the discussion, and the Times newspaper then followed up on that. So that was an example of how, you know, there's still a job to be done with politicians, for example, saying that the solutions to the climate response in the context of the historic environment are complex, and there's no simple, easy one solution such as solar panels. So feedback from stakeholders, I think we're setting a new mindset that heritage can be and should be part of the solution. That's now entering people's conversations and discussions and debates. We're there as something that has to be taken into account very much as the city moves towards net carbon zero. I think it's enhanced our reputation as a forward-looking partner in city management. Not simply about preserving what's from the past, but very much about being a partner in the management of the city in the future. And I think it's also subsequently facilitated funding applications. We're seen to be an innovator, and publicizing these types of things always helps with funding bodies, whether they're government, non-government, private funding bodies, etc. Putting these things into the public domain definitely helps in terms of funding applications for this important work. So that's all I have to say. Hopefully that was useful. Very much not the technical side of things, but focusing more on the community and public engagement aspects.
Thank you so much, Nick. Last but not least, I would like to ask Ian to take the floor. Thank you, Ian.
Hello. Gab, we're running slightly late. Do you want me to finish at past, or do you want me to do 20 minutes?
I appreciate that, Ian. Do take the time that you were given, and I'll not rush things. I'll tie things up at the end a little bit sooner.
Okay. So if I do overrun, just shout and stop me. But I'll share my screen. Okay, can everyone see that, or at least one person see that? I'm assuming that's
all good.
Oh, good. Okay, fine, great. So I'm going to talk about a project in Glasgow called Sauchiehall Street Avenue. I titled the talk "Public Realm Design in Sensitive Places," which is probably a bit clunky, it's really about designing a conservation area, but actually it's probably applies to all the approach I take to most of my projects anyway. I should just say that I'm a landscape architect and urban designer. Have worked in Scotland and lived in Scotland for 15 years in my career, but now work in London. And we picked up this job really because the commissioning client in Glasgow had seen some of my work in Clapham Old Town, which again is another fairly sensitive conservation area in London. I'm trying to get this thing to move. Oh, there we go. I'll just give you an overview of the bigger project, which is called the Avenues, and it's a city deal project. It's worth over £100 million, and the idea is that we create essentially a network of connected streets within the city centre, which have green and blue infrastructure. Basically, that means trees and some form of sustainable drainage, and a connected network of cycle lanes and footways to try and encourage active travel. So it's a sustainability project to sort of essentially mitigate or counter the negative effects of climate change. The whole of the city centre of Glasgow is virtually a conservation area. The top left, you can see the little purple dots indicate where Sauchiehall Street is, or where the part of Sauchiehall Street that we're dealing with is. I just thought to put a little note in here about the process we went through. So it took about 5 years from starting to design it to actually getting it built. We were involved, or I was involved in the concept and detailed design stages, and the City Council were then involved in making the planning application and the technical design and the construction phase. So it's a big joint effort of which I'm responsible for, essentially steering the concept and detailed designs. I just thought it interesting to put it a little bit of historical context. So the street, you know, the 19th century street essentially had two principal components. Had footways, it had carriageways. The carriageways were very traditionally shared. So lots of different activity takes place there. Not just the movement of carriages, as the word suggests, but you got a lot of pedestrians, cyclists, and other motorized forms start to come in as well with the trolley buses. In the 20th century, the street changed quite dramatically with the introduction of the motor car or the increased dominance of the motor car. So it still had the two primary components of the footway and the carriageway, but it also had a significant amount of space that was given over to parking, which you can see in this picture on the right-hand side. And also a lot of infrastructure came in to really manage the motor car, traffic lights, signage, parking restrictions, pedestrian guardrails start getting put in to keep pedestrians off the carriageway and things like that. So a lot of stuff came in. And then in the 21st century, we had to reimagine the street for the next sort of 100 years, I guess. I mean, I suppose things will change again at some point, but we introduced essentially three new components. We still got the footways, we still got the carriageway, but we also need cycle lanes so that we have this third kind of movement infrastructure. We have trees, which are part of this thing called green infrastructure, which they obviously they have a role to play in the mitigation of the excesses of climate change. And then we have blue infrastructure, which is also known as sustainable drainage, which takes many forms. In this case, we ended up with some permeable paving underneath the trees. It wasn't as extensive as we wanted it to be, but there are various reasons why that didn't happen in full. The next phases of the avenues we're going to have an extensive network of rain gardens, which collect all the surface water off the street, and stop it going into the Clyde, and stop pollution events occurring. Because the system, the combined sewer system in Glasgow is completely overloaded and it can't deal with more water. So we're taking water out of that system in the next phases. And the other component I put on there is seats, which I think is very important. And when you're trying to make the street a public space, you absolutely must have seats. So these 5 components, if you like, or 6 components, are absolutely essential to the modern street or to the 21st century street. And kind of regardless of what townscape situation you find yourself in. I mean, this is a conservation area, but I think equally, in most instances within a World Heritage site as well, these principles can still apply. So the scheme, the image on the left obviously shows how the street was before. Essentially it was four traffic lanes wide. 2 of the traffic lanes were given over to essentially parking activities. So what we did is we got rid of 2 traffic lanes and swapped them for what's called a bi-directional cycle track, and then this verge through the middle of the street, which where we're able to put the green and blue infrastructure, i.e. the trees and the sustainable drainage and all the seating and a lot of the street furniture as well, such as bush shelters and cycle parking, lighting. Again, its primary aim is to get people walking and cycling through the city centre rather than driving as much as possible. So there's a picture at sort of ground level of the scheme from last year. So you can see these components in operation. We still, I was talking before about the space we created for this to get the cycle lanes and the tree planting was generated by essentially removing the parking and narrowing the carriageway by half. The car on the right, for instance, is within a disabled bay, and there's still loading on the street. So all those activities that are necessary are still accommodated within the scheme. It was just that the parking was removed to give us the space essentially to put in these new facilities. I set out these 5 principles really for working within sensitive areas, but I think they sort of apply really to working in any areas, or at least most of the stuff I do within the city. Most of my work, sorry, is within the city, so most of these areas can be classed as sensitive areas, whether they're formally protected in conservation area with a conservation area status or something grander like a World Heritage site. It's sort of irrelevant really, because I think these apply to all of the work that I do. Simple, again, it really is so simple. It's just all we did is we made the footway slightly wider. We put the trees down in the middle of the street, principally because that was the space where there were least utilities. We put a cycle lane on the inside of the trees so they were protected from the sort of motor vehicle activity, and it's all within Glasgow city centre, which is within this very formal grid. So everything is just long and straight. We stuck to that. Those sort of guiding that overriding structure. This idea as well about the public realm should be neutral. Again, the buildings themselves are much more interesting than the ground plane. So the idea that I don't really want the ground plane to ever compete, if I can help it, with the architecture. So the materials we use, so that the crushed stone finish to the cycle track is sort of picks up the blonde sandstone of the buildings. The slabs on the footway are Caithness sandstone, which is a standard throughout Glasgow city centre, and again they're quite sort of soft brown, reasonably local stone, which again is quite neutral. We don't really introduce pattern into that or anything too complex. So the idea is that the architecture still dominates in terms of we try and not compete with that, and that's really the case, I think, with most of the stuff that I do. Minimal, again, trying to keep it as simple as possible. Without you must provide what you have to provide, so that the components have to go in there, the trees have to go in, the seats have to go in, the cycle stands have to go in. But you try and do it in an economical way as possible. You provide enough that they can function, but not really overfill it with stuff. Again, this idea of context can be revealed so that you can still, the sort of intrinsic character of the street can still be experienced. And then this idea of scale and finding components which fit with the scale of the street. These Sauchiehall Street is a big primary street in Glasgow, and the buildings are big and strong and bold, and so everything you do in the landscape has to sort of reflect that a little bit. So we chose big trees, but they're all of a fastigiate habit, which means they grow kind of upright, columnar in form. They're spaced quite far apart, actually, around about 10-metre centres, although that varies because of, again, you can't establish an exact rhythm because of the utilities underground. So everything is spaced out, and it tries to not compete with, but at least be appropriate to the scale of the actual street that it finds itself in. And then this idea about being contemporary, I don't think there's any need to be pastiche when working in these historically sensitive areas. So you can see that the seats there are thoroughly kind of modern in that they're stainless steel and they're hardwood. The cycle stands, again, they're also in stainless steel. You can see that there's a lamp, there's a lighting mast in the sort of middle ground, where again, that's sort of a tapered stainless steel component. So I mean, there may be instances where it's appropriate to copy a sort of historic style, but given the nature of Sochiol Street, it has many additions from its kind of beginnings into sort of 1860s, 70s, and 80s. It has no sort of fixed era in which it's still maintained, so that we don't have to. So we can confidently put in stuff from this era, and as long as it sort of complies with some of the other principles that I set out, that the whole thing can kind of work in harmony. I'm also going to talk about things that didn't work very well or could be done better. Now, there's a number of components in this image which I class as visual clutter, and most of them are unnecessary. For instance, if you look at the ground plane, the double yellow lines on the street, we don't need to have them. We could control parking in a different way through a restricted parking zone. The centre line, the white dash centre line down the middle of the street, again, is unnecessary. It's a discretionary thing that was put in by when the scheme went down. These yellow backing boards on these signs, again, are discretionary. They don't really need to go in. The sign can just be a standalone. The parking plates here don't need to sit on the post. They could have been fixed to cycle stands, or they could be fixed to the buildings. So there's a number of other things that could be done, and it specifically states in the regulations as well, even if you are going to use double yellow lines in a conservation area, you can reduce the width of them from 100 millimeters to 50 millimeters and change the color so that it's less visually intrusive. But so there's obviously room for improvement. Again, the big signs on the not part of my initial designs, obviously, is some department in Glasgow comes along and attaches these big banners to the posts, which obviously I'm not quite sure what they mean, but whether they contribute or detract from the street scene, I'm not quite sure. So there's a few criticisms. And I'm just going to run through a few pictures before I finish, really, just to show you how the thing kind of turned out in the end and how it's kind of working. So as you can see, the trees are quite interesting because there's often a concern with introducing trees into an environment in which there have never been trees before, that they're somehow going to block views or block important views, or be unable to see the sort of architecture in the background. But of course, your view constantly changes, and the tree is just part of that view now. It's not blocking a view. It's not stopping anything happening. It's just part of the scene. And I really think there's not that many streets that won't be enhanced by the right tree or the right trees. So I'm just sort of flicking through, really, just to give you a feel for how the thing kind of looked in the end. And I think that's just about it, really. So yeah, so that's at the end. So I guess I'm just going to stop sharing and we're going to go to some questions. And I think I've finished on time as well.
Amazing stuff, Ian. Thank you so much. Can I invite all our speakers to come back and put their cameras on, please? I do have a few questions. I am conscious of the time. So what I will do is I've collected all the questions from the question and answer box. So if we haven't had the opportunity to answer them, I will get them out to the speakers and we'll make them available on email to you. So what I'll do is I'll just kick off with my first question from Marco, and this is for Leela. And this is, how often should a pre-1911 building be checked by a professional?
I don't think there's a sort of specific time frame. I mean, for gutters and downpipes, we say twice a year, but that may be unrealistic. My advice would be get a pair of binoculars and just check it yourself. And you guys, I think it's the Edinburgh Adapts guide actually is very good at having a checklist of things you can check yourself. So
fantastic, thank you, Leela. Something for Jan about the Basel project. Did any of the owners not buy into participating? This person says we have 19 owners among 30 flats and at least 8 are absentee owners. You're very lucky if all owners are willing to take part and attend meetings. This is a function of relatively well-off owners. Lower income blocks can find more problems. Do you have any comments for this, Jan?
Yeah, thanks, Gabby. Yeah, it's a very good point because that's one of the challenge you have to face when you're dealing with multi-ownership tenements building, absentee landlords. So there are some solutions. Obviously, you need everyone to agree to the scheme because otherwise you can go ahead just for a matter of agreeing communal works that affect all the properties. So in Edinburgh, we've got a scheme that is called the missing share scheme, and that's where the council is getting involved when owners are struggling to deal with absentee landlords who can't or don't want to pay their share of the works. And the council can take over, pay for the cost on behalf of the absentee landlords, and then recover the cost from the absentee landlords, but it's going to cost them more money. Another thing which is important to consider is that there are potentially maybe more on energy efficiency side of things, but there are schemes in Scotland where people with low income can get help and funding to cover the cost of some energy efficiency measures. So it's also something to consider.
Great, thank you, Jan. Now I have a question. I've got a couple of questions which I'll roll into one, a few points for Ian regarding Sauchiehall Street.
Yeah.
So just first of all, Barbara Alexander asks, how do you consider space and access for wheelchair users in the kind of layout that you've presented this morning? She points out that the curb seems high and they have to cross cycle lanes, street furniture in the middle of a way rather than on the side, etc. So that's the first point. And the second questions are, did you incorporate waste bins as part of the overall street look? And finally, what species of tree did you use in Sauchiehall Street and why? Okay,
let's start with the first one. Right, all the junctions are raised flush. So whenever there's at a junction point, there's a completely flush level surface, which is easy to wheel across. The cycle lane was deliberately put at footway level, so there was no step down into the cycle lane and step back up again to make it easy for physically impaired people to kind of get across to the curbside. The curbs were, I wanted the curbs to go into 60 millimeters high, which is the sort of limit, the lowest limit which the visually impaired people feel comfortable with when trying to navigate the street and to find an edge. The council ended up putting them at 100 millimeters for whatever reason. But at every spot, sorry, every point along the street where there is a junction, a legitimate sort of need to cross the street, they're always flush. Yeah. So what was the next question? Was the question?
Next question was about how did you incorporate the waste bins as part of the overall street look?
Yeah, interesting. Now, in some of those earlier images from before we started, there's a lot of trade waste bins on the street, and the council did a really good job at getting the traders to rehouse all their waste internally. It was as simple as that. We looked at schemes for putting the bins underground, but in the end we found there was actually, I think, a local bylaw which said they weren't really allowed to put bins on the street. So that was just invoked, if you like, so that they suddenly the street is free of all those big plastic bright red trade waste bins. So yeah, that's how that was dealt with. And the final one was species
of tree. Yes.
Yeah. There's a mixture. There's about half a dozen species in there, and I'm trying to think. So, for instance, there's an Acer campestre, which is a field maple, a variety of that. There's a Norway maple in there. There's a thing called ginkgo biloba, which is a really ancient tree. All of them have a similar kind of habit, i.e. they grow kind of upright. Again, that was to try and avoid conflicts with the buses on the street. But I can, I can. If the person who it is wants to email me directly, then I can give the actual list out, because I'm working on the next phase of the project now on Argyle Street. I'm doing the planting schedules today, so.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Ian. Another one for Leela, please. Again, from Marco. He says, is algae on an external wall always a sign of dampness within the wall, or can it just be a surface phenomenon?
Not necessarily a problem with the wall, unless you leave it to the extent of becoming a problem to the wall. But if your building has sort of background heat, that should be helping a bit. But this is often a surface thing, and it can be cleaned. Again, we have a lot of guides on cleaning algae vegetation from masonry walls.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you all for your questions. Some of them are very detailed and specific, which is great. So what I'll do is, because we are running out of time, is I will put these to our speakers to answer over email, and then we'll get them out to you. Also, to answer Charles Strang's question about other World Heritage cities having urban design review panels, I'll put this to our lovely partnership for the Atlas project and get some answers back to you as well. So I think that really concludes this morning. It's been really interesting to hear all of the talks. A huge thanks to all our speakers for giving their time this morning. I hope you enjoyed it. This meeting has been recorded, so we'll make that available to you afterwards for posterity. And I'll get back with the follow-up questions. And as we say, if you have any other questions or want any other information, please do just drop me an email. It's Gabriella@ewht.org.uk. Thank you very much.